Also, like Joy mentioned, I was in her cohort, and I think you're very fortunate because even when I was a student, I felt like I was able to learn a lot from Joy. So you're very, very lucky to have her as a TA. So this is a workshop that we normally teach to prospective students. So it is absolute beginner HTML and CSS. So it'll be a nice little break after your data structures portion of the course. And like Joy mentioned, it does get better. The cohort I'm in, we are a couple weeks past data structures, and it really does start to feel a little less overwhelming. And the really cool thing about HTML, CSS moving into that is we get to start seeing some real tangible things from our code. They're very powerful languages. So without further ado, we'll just get started. I kind of went through my introduction, but I will tell you just a little bit about my background. So I come from a non-tech background. I was in education for 9 years before I decided to switch to being a developer. My partner, my brother are both in the technology world, so that's kind of how I was exposed to that. And then I attended CodeOp from January to July of this year. I had the absolute best experience. I love CodeOp. And I will be starting my software engineer role in January. So that's kind of been my journey so far. And I think that you guys know enough about CodeOp. I don't really need to go through that. So I would love to hear from you. Feel free to, you don't have to comment in the chat unless that's where you feel most comfortable, but I would just be curious, now that we are moving into HTML, CSS, are there any sort of projects that you're interested in building? Is it, maybe like a game that you're interested in building, or portfolio, or are you just open to everything? Are there any opinions that you have or wishes that you'd like to build? And you can throw it in the chat if you're more comfortable with that. See the chat here. Okay, so it sounds like we're pretty open to building whatever, so that works out well. So in our workshop today, we'll be building a portfolio. So it's obviously a good thing to have. When you graduate, I think having a portfolio as a junior is something that can kind of set you apart because not everyone goes through that process. So we'll build a basic portfolio today, but it's a kind of a good starting point. All right, so let's talk about web development. So you obviously have been learning a lot about JavaScript, but there is a little bit more to web development than just JavaScript. There's HTML and there's CSS. Those three languages work together to create web pages. And the way that works is they form this set of instructions for your browser. So Chrome, Safari, Firefox, whatever your browser is, it's going to recognize those instructions, interpret it, and then it will display a web page based on those instructions. So let's kind of dive into specifically what these languages do for our website. So HTML is the basic content of our website. It's the building blocks, it's the structure. So I like to think of HTML kind of like a Word document, where you're typing and you'll see differentiation, you'll see headers, you'll see paragraphs, and they might look a little bit different, but for the most part, it's not that pretty. And so CSS then is our styling layer, and that's where we get into how does our content look? I've heard it compared to being the makeup for HTML. So it just kind of, finishes it off, styles it. And then JavaScript, which you're obviously familiar with, it gives us that interaction piece. A really good metaphor for these languages is thinking of a house. So if you think about HTML in a house, you would think of it as like we said, the content and the structure. So we're thinking things like the floors, the walls, the staircases, right? And then CSS, that styling layer, is going to be things like the wall paint, the color of your furniture, how you've arranged your furniture, what the layout is. And then JavaScript would be things like, okay, if I turn on, if I flip the switch, then the light comes on. Or if I want my water to run, I'll turn the faucet on. So I wanted to share this website with you all. I'll just share this in the chat so that you can visit it as well if you're curious. This is another example of HTML, CSS, and then that JavaScript layer. So we start with HTML and we have, this sort of container box. And then we have, okay, we need two eyes and we have the line that will eventually form our mouth. But then with CSS, we're able to manipulate those things to look the way that we want them to. So we've shaped our container to be round. We've made those eyes align with each other, and we've curved the mouth so that it actually looks like a mouth. We've also even added some basic animation here, which you can do with CSS. CSS is fairly powerful, but then JavaScript is what makes it really fun, where we can start to do things like move, make it jump. I think we can add more, right? So JavaScript makes it quite a bit more interactive, but that's not to say that HTML and CSS don't give us, some of the important stuff. And here's the source code if you wanted to see it as well. So that website will give you that. Okay, let's dive deeper now into HTML. And I do want to just point out, I think maybe it's already been clear, but we only will be talking about HTML and CSS today. You'll hit that JavaScript piece next week when you work with DOM. So what exactly is HTML? It's the standard language for creating web pages. So it's actually the one and only language for web page structures. So all browsers understand it. You really can't be a web developer without knowing HTML. Important distinction here, it's technically considered a language of marks and not of programming. So JavaScript is going to be a programming language. But when we talk about marks, if you think back all the way to your first assignment where you had to create that portfolio and you were using markup, that's really more what we're dealing with when we talk about HTML. And then HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And this is the name they gave it upon invention. So that hyper refers to the fact that it's more than just text. It's also images, it's video. So we have the text piece, but we can do a lot more. It's more powerful than just having text. And like we mentioned, it describes the structure of a web page, not its appearance. All right, so let's dive into the nitty-gritty here. What does HTML look like? You already know this because you know JavaScript, but just an important thing to remember when you're starting to learn new coding languages is every detail matters, right? So we tend to gloss over things like punctuation when we're just reading on a page, but your browser is not going to do that. It's going to look at every single detail, and the punctuation really matters in HTML, specifically these brackets. Sorry, this is my cat Max. He'll probably be joining us a couple of times, but he likes to type on the keyboard, so he can't be there. Okay, so looking at the syntax here, HTML will always, not always, most of the time consist of an opening bracket and a closing bracket. And sorry, let me say that again, an opening tag and a closing tag. Your opening tag will have this angle bracket here and this angle bracket here. The thing that is inside the angle bracket will tell you what type of element, HTML element, am I expecting. So in this example, P is going to stand for paragraph. So what we're saying right here is I'm opening my tag and I want this to be a paragraph. And then our closing tag looks almost exactly the same, but we also have this / in it. And that's just communicating I'm now closing this tag. Any content that we would want to be in our paragraph in this example would then go in between those tags. And we'll show an example of that in a second. Now, like I mentioned, most HTML tags will have an opening tag and a closing tag, but there are some that do not accept content. And so those will just be opened and closed in the same tag. So for example, an image, you're not going to expect text content in between that. So for an image tag, we would just open it, write the name of our tag, img, and then we would use that / and close it. Same thing for input. Input would be something that you would expect in a form, for example. So if you have a user typing, you're obviously not going to be able to predict what that text content is going to be. So we would just expect to have one tag for input. Whoops. There we go. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit deeper. So like we said, we have this first opening tag, and in it we have our tag name. And then we have our closing tag with that /, and it also has to have the corresponding tag name. And then we have our content in the middle. And then finally, we refer to this entire thing, the opening, closing tag, and the content in the middle, we refer to that as an element. Here's a concrete example. So now we're looking at, okay, a paragraph. We have our opening paragraph tag, our closing paragraph tag, and then our inner content that says this is a paragraph. So if your HTML file if you have this line written, then what it will display is a paragraph that says this is a paragraph. And we would refer to this entire thing as an element. So I might say, hey, let's look at line 12 at that paragraph element. Okay, before we move on to attributes, I just want to stop. Are there any questions so far about what we've covered? Feel free to type it in the chat. Feel free to just shout it out. Okay, cool. We'll move on then. Okay, so then we start talking about attributes, and HTML attributes are words we use that HTML will recognize, so they're specific words, and they allow us to target and manipulate specific HTML elements. Attributes will always be in the opening tag, so you'll always be looking in that opening tag for them. And this is what they look like. So you'll notice we have this opening paragraph tag. We have our text content of Apple, and then we have our closing paragraph tag. But we've added this attribute of class. Class, I like to think of as a category. I know you've done classes in JavaScript, so it might be a little bit more familiar, but I like to think of it as a category. So let's say I have this list here. I have an apple, an orange, and a peach. Actually, I'm going to take away the peach. Let's just say I have this apple and this orange. And maybe on my web page, I want all the fruits I'm listing to be styled the color red. Instead of having to do that for each individual tag, if I use this class attribute, I can basically say, hey, I'm going to create this class called fruits, and anything that has that attribute on it is now in this category, this class. And then I can just target that class to do what I want with my styling. So really, it's because developers are lazy, we're just making our lives a little bit easier, right? We love to do that. So we'll see class a lot. It's really the main way that we target HTML elements for styling later on. And then there's also another really common attribute called ID. ID is a little bit different than class. ID, kind of in the name, it's a unique identifier. So it can only one ID. So for example, this favorite ID can only exist once in your content. Class, you could have multiple things in the class fruit, but ID, you can only have one HTML element that's to each ID. So you could have another ID on your page that is maybe least favorite, and that's fine, but you need to make sure that each ID is a specific and unique ID. Okay, that's attributes for us. Now, the next thing that we'll see very, very, very often in HTML are containers. And containers are really just used to help us group things. So we'll use them a lot for styling, but we also just use them to help us organize our code. They're not automatically going to display something. That's an important thing to keep in mind. So here we see our class shopping basket is part of a div container. Div is usually what we see when we're using our containers. That's the tag that we'll expect. You can see here we've added this class shopping basket. Now, even though the class shopping basket is only on that div container, because everything else is nested below it, so each of those paragraph tags are nested inside of it, those are all going to be affected by that shopping basket class. So if we style the div container shopping basket, it will still have some effect on the things within it. Okay, cool. So that's kind of an overview of HTML. A lot of this workshop is going to be actually just writing code, because that's really the best way to learn it. So I'm going to share CodePen with you all. You may be familiar with it, but I think that you get the most out of this workshop if you follow along with it. So you can go ahead and visit CodePen, and you can just click on this button right here that says pen, and that will create a new pen for you. And you can see here we have HTML and we have CSS. I'm actually going to just minimize my JavaScript since we won't be dealing with that today. And for now, I'm also going to move my CSS just out of the way for a little bit. We'll come back to it, but for right now, we're just going to deal with HTML. So like I mentioned, we'll be building a portfolio today. So the first thing that I want to do is just start writing some HTML to see how this is going to display. So I think we had used that paragraph example before. So I'm going to start with my opening angle bracket. I'm going to write the P for paragraph, and then I'm going to close that first opening tag. And then a good habit to get into is to just write your closing tag right away, just so that you don't forget it. Notice with my closing tag, I have that first angle bracket and then a forward slash to denote that it's a closing tag, the letter P to correspond with my opening tag, and then that last angle bracket. So that's going to create our paragraph tag, but we don't have any content inside of it yet. So we can write something like this is a paragraph, and we'll expect that to show up on our page. There you go. Easy, right? Not too bad after trees and graphs, I would say. Okay, I'm getting what I want now. My paragraph's displaying. Let's actually make this a portfolio now. Instead of using a paragraph, I really want a header here. This is going to kind of be my like welcome intro page. So to use a header in HTML, we have a couple options. We can use, the first letter we'll use is H, and then we can use any number between 1 all the way up to 6. An H1 element is going to be the largest header you can have. So I'm going to say welcome here, and I'll close this. We'll see it displayed pretty big. If I wanted to go a little bit smaller, I might do an H3, and I'll say this is my portfolio, and then I'll close that H3. And you can see that it's slightly smaller, but it's still a header. Okay, cool. I'll give you a second to be able to catch up with that. And I think I'm going to say, instead of welcome, this is my portfolio, I think I'm going to change it to welcome to my portfolio. My name is Sarah. Feel free to write whatever you want. This is your portfolio. Okay. That looks good so far. I'm happy with that. Let's go ahead and add a container now. So we had talked about those div containers that help us organize our code and style it later on. So I'm going to write my first div here, but because I want both of these headers to be within this container, I'm going to close my div after those headers. And I'm going to also tab these headers just to keep that indentation, make it a little bit more readable for me. Notice that when I added this div, nothing actually showed up on my page, because when we first start out, that div is going to be invisible to us. It exists, but it's not showing up. There's no styling. And I want to go ahead and apply a class to this as well. And I'm going to call this class, I'll say my intro. When we write class names, we usually want to keep them lowercase. And we want to, if we do have 2 words, we would use a hyphen. So if I wanted to say intro title, it could look like that. I'll keep it just intro for now. Okay, so we've made our div container. We've assigned it the class of intro. And then within our div container, we have a H1 header that says welcome to my portfolio, and H3 header that says my name is Sarah. This is pretty good so far. It's pretty easy, which we like. So let's now just take a look at what CSS would look like. We'll go back to the slides in a second so we can really dive into it. But just as an example, let's say I want to style this entire thing. I luckily have access to it through this class because these nested elements are part of this container. So in CSS, I can access that class. The way that I access a class in CSS, I'm going to start by putting just a dot and then the name of the class. So I've done dot intro. And then I'll use these curly braces to contain all of the properties that I want to apply. Just for the sake of showing you that this div does exist, I'm going to add a background color. So I start by typing the CSS property name. I add a colon, and then I can say the color I want. In this case, I'll just do blue. And then I end with that semicolon. And you can see here now, okay, this is my div. It does exist. It was invisible, but it does exist. Now I'm able to see how these things fit within this div. All right, I'll give you a second just to catch up with that, get this code written, and then we'll move back to the slides and dive a little bit deeper into CSS. While everyone's catching up with this, feel free to ask any questions you might have. Okay, I'm going to move back to the slides. We'll come back to that in a second. So if you weren't able to catch all of it, that's okay. We'll be there soon. All righty, so let's move into CSS. CSS means cascading style sheets. It's a language that describes the visual appearance of HTML elements, like we mentioned. And we actually have, I think this is it. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to type this into the chat for you. We have a resource. It's just W3, but they have some really good stuff on CSS. So I'll drop that in the chat there. And I'm going to open this here so that we can take a look at it. And this is a really cool example of the power of CSS. So we have this example here, and this example, we'll take a look at it if there's no CSS. So this is just HTML, no CSS is attached to it. We can see there are different, headers. We can tell that there's some differentiation happening here, but it's not really styled. It doesn't really look attractive. With one CSS sheet, so multiple properties on that sheet, but just with one sheet, we're able to completely change the way that it looks. We're able to change what the font looks like, the color of the font, the color of the background, different sections. You can really see the containers that we were talking about here. We have a container here, we have a container here, right? And then what's really cool is we can take a look, completely different style sheet, exact same HTML, and the difference is quite astounding, right? Not only are the colors different, the containers are different, the font is different, the layout is different. With the style sheet 1, we had this. Notice the style sheets are listed here. We moved to style sheet 2, and we're able to see that even the layout can change with CSS. And that's why we say it's such a powerful language. We can get this styles as well, and then this one too. So really, really cool example. And I think it shows just how important and helpful CSS can be. Alrighty, so let's look at an example now. This is our HTML that we have. So we have an H1 header that says hello world, and then we have a paragraph that says this is my first CSS example. But you can see in this example we have that it's styled quite differently. So let's take a look at what that CSS looks like. So you'll notice that we first start by saying, okay, I want to access my H1 header. So what this is saying, CSS is communicating, it's saying, all right, H1 header right here. I want the color to be blue. And notice that when we say color, we're referring to the font color, not the background color. It's an important thing to remember. I want the color to be blue. I want the background color to be yellow. And I also want to add a border. But notice when we say border that there's a lot more happening on the right side of our colon. So different properties are going to expect different things. With something like color, you can just write the word blue and it knows what to do. You also can write a hex code, which we'll look at a little bit later, or you can use something called RGB to affect the color. So there's multiple ways that you can change the color, but CSS, if you say color, it will be able to interpret any of those different ways. Same thing with background color, we can just say the color, but with border, it's going to expect 3 values. The first one is the size of the border. The second one is, do you want your border solid? Do you want it dotted? Do you want it dashed? And then the last one is, what color would you like the border? It will always expect it in this order. So if you were to, for example, switch those things around, it's going to get a little bit confused. So you want to make sure that you stick to the syntax that it expects. Something like CSS, you're going to Google all the time, to be honest. There are things you use in CSS all the time, for example, like color, but there are things that you are going to use once in a blue moon that you're just going to have to Google quickly. And CSS, I mean, there's just so many resources online. You can just quickly say, CSS border, and it will pull it up right there. I mean, it's pretty easy to find the thing that you need with CSS. Okay, and then looking further, then we close this curly brace and we say, okay, now I want to access my paragraph tags. One thing I want to point out, in the example on my CodePen, I used a class, remember? And I said, okay, I'm trying to access this class. So I added that dot at the beginning. The dot is important because the dot says, I'm going to tell you about a class. If you want to just access an element, you can just say the name of the element. You can just say H1, but it will access every H1 tag on the page. So that can be helpful if you want all your H1s to look alike, great. But if you don't, you need to be aware of that. And in that case, you're probably going to use something like a class or maybe even an ID to access it. All right, so moving into that selector, like I mentioned, when we just use the element name, it applies to all of those elements. But we can use a selector to get a little bit more specific. So when we use that class attribute on our paragraph tag, so we use the class fruits, we can then use it as a selector in CSS by adding that dot and then apply the styling that we want. And this is our result. So we had this HTML that said, this is my first CSS example. We added this color property red, and then this is the result that we get. Here we want to add, we want our class fruits to be green, but then we see something totally different now. This is to access an ID. So for class, you're going to add a dot and then the name of the class. For an ID, you'll use a hash and then the name of the class. And then, like we mentioned, for just an HTML element, you don't have to do anything in front of it. You can just say the name of the element, but you have to remember that that's will apply to all of those. Okay, cool. That's CSS. Now we're going to jump back to our code bin and we're going to add quite a bit more. Okay, so I think that it would be helpful to just take a second, remind yourself of the code that we've written so far. Take a look at it, think about how this is all working together, think about your attributes, notice that your CSS is accessing those attributes. And then let's go ahead and add another section to our portfolio. I think that an About Me section would be a good idea. So we're going to start by just creating a div. Honestly, a lot of times when I'm writing my code for CSS, I just start by creating my containers because it kind of gives me the idea of, okay, this is now a distinct section. I know I'm going to need a container for it. And just having that div to start just kind of helps me out with it. I'm going to go ahead and set a class name for this div because I know I'm going to be styling it. So I'll set this class as About Me. And now I can add some headers. I've already used an H1 header and that was like my welcome. So I think I'm going to make it just a slightly bit smaller and I'll use an H2 header here. And I'll just use the title About Me. And then I'll make sure to have that closing tag that corresponds. And we have that showing up right now. I'm also going to add a paragraph below that. I'm not going to sit here and type it out this whole time. So I can just in CodePen, I can type lorem and then hit tab and it will fill that in for me, which is very helpful. And there we go. I make sure to add my closing tag there. Okay. So we've got some HTML showing up. It's not looking very pretty right now. I just want to start. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this background color blue. That was just for an example. But I noticed when I had that blue background color, there was this weird extra space on the side. And this is a margin. Sometimes your browser will have some set default things happening that you maybe don't want happening. I really don't want that margin here. So what I can do is I can use the CSS selector. This asterisk is going to basically select everything in my HTML, everything on my page. And so I'm just going to go ahead and say margin, and I'm going to set that to 0 because I really don't want that there. And you'll notice that that takes it away right away. But just be aware that if you use that asterisk, it's going to apply to the entire page. So you want to be careful about that. Another thing that I'm noticing is I don't love this font. It's not my favorite. So I'm going to go ahead and set for everything on my page, all of the font. I'm going to go ahead and set that font family to without a serif because I really just don't think it looks that good. That's personal preference. Feel free to keep it if you like it. Okay, looking better. Now I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this background color. But I do need something for this background here. So I think what I'll do is I'll use an image. So you have the option to either, if you're working in, for example, VS Code in your file system, you can upload your own picture. But unfortunately with CodePen, you don't have that feature unless you have a paid version. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to use an image on the web, and I'm going to use that as my background image for this container. My first thought is before I can even add that image, this container is not very big right now. So I'm going to go ahead and set the height to probably about 500 pixels. And let's see what that does. So you can see that the About Me section got moved down because this container is now 500 pixels, when before it was just basically the size it needed to be to fit all of the content. So in that case, we had 2 headers. It was fitting that content and that was it. I want it to be bigger, so I've set it to 500 pixels. Feel free now to start Googling images, or if you have an image on the web somewhere that you like, I'm just going to copy and paste one that I already have for my background, and I will add it as a property here. So in this intro section, I'm going to use the property background image. Before we were using background color, but now I'm going to use background image. I'm going to write the words or the letters URL, and then I'm going to use parentheses. Inside of those parentheses, I'll copy the path to my image. So, important thing, if you're trying to copy this image from somewhere on the web, make sure you're doing right click and clicking copy image address, not just copy image. We need the address, the path to this image. I'm going to go ahead and paste that address there, and you can see, okay, cool. Now it's shown up. That was pretty nice. Starting to look better. Some of you might notice, though, if you do add an image, that you might see that your image is starting to repeat itself over and over in tile. So we have a couple of different properties that we can add on to help with that. Before I add these properties on, I'm going to make sure I have this semicolon. Otherwise, it's going to confuse CSS. I need to make sure that background image finishes with that semicolon. And then I can use this property background, background size. And I can write cover, and I can do background repeat. And I'm going to say no repeat because I don't want it to tile. And that should help. If you are having that tiling issue, this should hopefully solve your issue. So I'll give you a second to write that down. Search for the image that you need, copy it into your URL. Make sure there's nothing else happening here. So it's URL, parentheses, and then your image path. No spaces, no extra punctuation, like quotation marks or anything like that. Okay. Now I'm thinking, okay, I've got this background image. I'm happy with it. I want this stuff, though, to come down a little bit. So we can use a property called padding here to help us with that. Earlier, we had talked about margins, and that was that extra space outside of our container. Padding is going to give you space inside of your container. So I like to think of it like if you ever get a package in the mail that's like in a box and they've put, bubbles or bubble wrap or paper, something to pad whatever inside of it. That's a good way to think about padding. It's going to give you space, cushioning, but it will be inside of your container. So I can show you that if I just do padding here. Let's say I did 50 pixels. You'll see what this looks like. Okay. So notice that padding was applied all the way around. It wasn't just applied at the top. It wasn't just applied at the bottom. It was applied all the way around in a box. I really don't need it to apply all the way around. I really just want to apply it to my top. So what I can do here is I can just change padding to padding top. And you'll notice, okay, it now affected just the top here. I'm going to change it from 50. That didn't really do what I wanted. I'm going to change it, to 200. And that's going to help me out a little bit. Okay. Now, I'm noticing that this feels kind of squished. I don't like that it's just right against that. So I'm going to use a property now called text align, but I really want this applied to all of my text because it's happening down here as well, and I don't want to have to repeat myself. So I'm just going to go back up to that selector that we had selected everything, and I'm going to say text. I'm going to use the property text align, and I'm just going to set it to center. And that makes it look a little bit better, in my opinion. Okay, cool. Next thing I think I want to do is I want to work with these headers here. And I want to work with these headers just alone. I don't actually want to work with the whole div container. I just want to deal with these headers. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add another container, but it's just going to be around these headers. So within that outer intro container, I'm going to add a div. I'm going to open my div here, and then I will close it after my headers. And this is going to basically wrap them. I also want to make sure I keep these indented so that it's a little bit more readable. I'm still going to add a class to this div, and I'm going to call this class maybe intro title. And then down here, I'm going to use my selector dot intro title to apply some styling here. Now my CSS is getting a little bit crowded, so I want to add some comments to just maybe help organize them a little bit. So I'll add a comment here. And this is what CSS comments look like. A quick shortcut, if you're on Mac, is Command and then the /. I don't know what Windows is, so if someone does, please type it in the chat. But I'm going to just write intro here to help organize myself a little bit. Okay, so we've got our intro section. I've now selected the intro title, which is just using these headers here. And I think I want to add a background to this intro title because it kind of is blending in. This black text is blending in with this white background, and it just doesn't quite work for me. So what I'm going to start by doing is I think I'll start by just setting my font color to white. Remember, we just used the property color when we're trying to access the font color. So I'll set that. But then I want to change this background color here. So I'm going to set my background color. And like I mentioned before, you can just type white, black, whatever you need. But in this case, I want to be a little bit more specific. So I'm going to use this property, RGBA. The RGB is going to give us red, green, blue. So you give it a certain number for the red value, a certain number for the green value, a certain number for the blue, and it will combine to create a color. Couldn't tell you what colors they would create. That's something that you kind of have to Google and figure out what you're looking for. But the really nice thing about that last value, so I'll just start by doing zeros here because I really am actually going to try and get black. But then this last value gives us the option to add some opacity. So if I do something like 0.4, it's going to make it slightly opaque. If I wanted it more opaque, I might do 0.8, and you can see it's more opaque. But for this case, I think I'll do 0.4. Okay, it's looking better. Still noticing that everything's kind of feeling crowded and cramped. So I'm going to add some padding, give it a little bit of room to breathe. So in this intro title div, I'm going to do padding, and let's just do maybe 10 pixels and see how that looks. I still think that's a little small, so I'm just going to experiment here, make it a little bit bigger. That's okay. I'm okay with that. Okay, I'll give you a second to catch up with this. What we just did was we set our color to white on this div section here for the title of our intro. We then used our background color property and we used RGBA. We used the value 000, which gives us black. That 0.4 gives us some opacity. And then we set some padding so that we could let it breathe a little bit. Alrighty. I'm thinking let's move back to our HTML. It can be helpful to kind of bounce back and forth. Some people have different ways of working. Some people prefer to just write all of their HTML at once and then write all of their CSS. I prefer to kind of take it section by section. It helps me just keep track of what I've done so far, what my vision is for this, but everyone's different and you'll find what works for you. But I'm going to come back to this About Me section, and I'm thinking that I'd like to add an image here. So we've used these HTML tags that we open and we close, but let's use an image tag, which is just going to be one tag, and it looks like this. We'll open the bracket, we'll say IMG, and then we'll close the bracket. Nothing happens. Why is that? Well, we haven't actually told what image we want. And we're going to actually use an attribute here to give our image a value. So what we'll do is we'll use this attribute src, which stands for source. We'll set an equal sign, and then we'll add our quotation marks. In these quotation marks, we're going to once again use a path to an image to give that image a source that tells the HTML, please use this image source to render an image on the page. I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste again, but feel free to search for an image on Google. I think I had searched like female avatar coding or something like that. And you can see now if I scroll down that this image has now popped up on my page. So just to review, we opened that image tag, we typed IMG, then we use our source attribute src equals quotation marks and then the image path. Important thing to notice, when we did it in CSS, when we were using an image, we did not have quotation marks. We just used this URL, we passed in the image address. In HTML, when we're using attributes, we have to use quotation marks. So we write the attribute name equals quotation marks, and then the value we're trying to give it, in this case, the image path. Okay, cool. Now, let's use we've used our class selector. We've used this selector to access everything on the page. Let's just try and access now all the image tags. This is going to work out for me because I only have one image on the page, so it's not going to be too much of an issue. This is part of my About Me section, so I'm going to add that comment here. I'm going to say About Me. And then here, I'm just going to write IMG. No dot this time because it's not a class. It's just the image tag in HTML. And I want to make this a little bit smaller. So I'm going to use the width property here, and I'm just going to say 25%. And what that will do is it's actually taking that image and it's reducing it down to 25% of its original size. You can also specify the height if you wanted to change it. So if you wanted to mess with the proportions, but in this case, I really don't. I want to keep the original proportions and it will just automatically adjust the height. So all I have to really do is just access that width. Okay, it's looking pretty good so far. I'm happy with what we've done. I like to just stop every once in a while as I have sections and think about, okay, are my different sections crowded? So I had focused on just this intro section, then I went down and looked at my About Me section, but now I'm thinking, okay, the transition between these two sections, it looks a little bit crowded. We have this container ends and then this About Me is right there. So what I'm going to do is I want to just add some padding here. In this case, you could also use a margin. You could take your About Me section, that container, and you could add a margin on top of it. Because your About Me section is white, your margin will also be white. Those would just blend together and you really wouldn't know the difference. But I want to just, for me, it feels better to just keep it as part of the padding so that I really have these distinct sections. So I'm going to just add some padding top to my About Me section. Now, to access my About Me section, I have already given it a class for this div container. So I can just come down here. I want to make sure I haven't already set it. I haven't, so I'm going to probably above the image, add this class selector, About Me, and I'm going to add the property padding top, and I'm going to set it to, I don't know, maybe 20 pixels. See if that looks good. Yeah, that looks good to me. Okay. It's looking pretty good. Let me check the time here. Okay, we're moving very, very quickly. I think that's because we were able to kind of gloss over some stuff that you guys have been exposed to already. So I will go ahead and maybe we can add one more thing. I'm thinking maybe a nav bar here. So we have our intro section, we have our About Me section. I'd like to add a nav bar actually above those sections. Notice that I have to go to the top of my file. So HTML is going to read your code in order. So if I want something to show up above my intro section, I have to make sure that I write it at the top of my file. I also think that it would be helpful at this point to show you this resource we have called the periodic table of HTML elements. So I'll share this in the chat for you. But this is a really cool resource. It doesn't, I don't think it has all of the HTML elements, but it has quite a few of them and really the important ones. And what's nice is you can see here, it has this color coding to give you a little bit more information about it. So for example, if you wanted to see HTML elements that refer to media, you could highlight over it. In this section, we have sectioning. And I wanted to point out this element right here, our nav element. When you click on an element in this website, it will even give you more explanation. So it says the HTML nav element represents a section of a page that links to other pages or to parts within the page. So a section with navigation links. And that's really what we're looking for in this case. So I'm going to use this nav as my container. Before we were using divs as our container, but in this case, I want to be specific. Part of the reason why we want to be as specific as possible with our HTML is for accessibility. So if someone were accessing your web page using a screen reader, for example, the more specificity we have within our HTML, the more specificity is going to be read aloud to them. So I want to make sure if I have the option that I can be more specific and say, okay, this section is going to be a nav section. So I'll create that there. Notice when I first create it, nothing pops up. So it's still one of these container elements. But as we add things within it, we'll see things start to pop up. So that nav section acts as our container. So we're going to make sure that everything else that we want within it is going to be nested down in between the opening and the closing tag. And I'm going to introduce another element that we haven't learned yet that is called an anchor element. And we represent that with an A. And this is for any sort of thing that is going to be a clickable link. So because this is our nav, because we're going to be clicking on things, we'll use this A tag. I think I'll just say my first link, I'll say, oh, I guess, yeah, I don't need an intro link because that's right there. So I'll just say about me. I'll close my A tag. And then I might add another line that is maybe contact and maybe another one for my resume. So I'll change this here to contact and then resume or CV, whichever you're comfortable and familiar with. Okay, cool. So you'll see that these start to show up here. But when I click them, nothing happens. Remember, we learned about something that helps us manipulate elements. We want to manipulate our elements so that we can click and something happens. So we're going to use an attribute to manipulate that element. So in the opening A tag, we're going to use an attribute called href. This, I think it stands for hyperlink reference. It's something along the lines of that. And it's basically the path that you want whatever the web page to take if you were to click on it. So I'm going to say href equals, and then remember we have to have quotations. Okay. In this case, I'm not trying to go to an outside page. I'm trying to actually get me down to my about me section. Here's where we're going to use an ID attribute. So far we've mainly been sticking with classes, but an ID attribute is going to be really helpful for things like this, because I can say, if I have a unique identifier on my about me section, so I'm going to add ID here, and I'm going to call it the same thing, but it's a unique identifier, so only will exist on right here. I'm going to say up here in my href, I can add this hash. Remember that refers to ID. I can say hash, and then the name of the ID I'd like it to visit, about me. And you'll see now that when I click on this link, it takes me down to the about me section. It could only go so far because we just don't have that much on our page, but I'll show you one more time. It takes me there. Href is necessary for any anchor tag. So what we have written here is actually not correct. We have to have an href tag. So I'm going to add that href here. But because I don't actually have a contact section, I can just do a hash for now, and that will be acceptable for the browser. If you don't have that hash, I believe what will happen is it's going to refresh every time, and that can be frustrating. So we just add that hash and it will act as though it's taking you somewhere. It's just not going to go anywhere. Okay, cool. Now, noticing it's kind of ugly. A lot of HTML elements, there's going to be some styling that's default. So for example, in anchor tags, you're going to see this underline and it starts off as blue. And then if you've clicked on it already, it'll turn purple. I don't love that. So I'm going to go ahead and add a class to my nav so that I can style it. And I'll just call this my class nav. I'm going to move down to my CSS. I'm going to add a comment so I can keep it organized. And I'm actually thinking, well, this nav section happens before my intro and about me. So I'm actually going to move that back up. I want it before my intro. So here we have a nav section. I'm going to use my class selector to access it. So I use .nav. Okay, and I think it just had maybe gotten rid of that background image because we didn't have our closing brace yet. Okay, I'll start by just setting a background color. So let's maybe make this background color gray. And I want to get rid of this line underneath. So what I can do is a property called text decoration, and I can set that to none. And that will hopefully should get rid of the lines. I'm wondering why that's not happening. Text decoration, none. Oh, I know why. Okay. So I'm like, why isn't this working? Because I've set this here. It's on my class nav. These things exist under class nav. Here's the thing. Our A tag has that default styling, not the nav class. So we have to actually go into that A tag to counteract what that default styling is. So I'm going to take this text decoration out of my nav class, and I'm just going to say for all of my A tags, so I don't need that dot, I just want to say for all of my A tags, I want my text decoration to be set to none. And there we go, now it works. So this is why CSS can kind of be frustrating sometimes. There are a lot of intricacies and a lot of having to figure out how different things are interacting with each other and where the styling's actually coming from that can make it really hard sometimes to figure out what you need to do to get what you're looking for. So that's kind of like the downside of CSS, is just figuring out where is the styling actually coming from and how can I change it. Okay, so I've gotten rid of that line. I also would like to change the color of this font back to white. And I'm thinking that looks a lot better. Another thing that we can use in CSS is basically a flexible box. So maybe you're familiar with it. It's something called Flexbox. And you see it a lot in modern web design because it helps your page to be very responsive. So if someone were to make the screen size smaller, or maybe they're visiting from a phone or a tablet, that flexible box, if you use it well, will make it a lot easier for you to take something that you've already styled and make sure that it still looks good on those smaller or bigger screens. So let's go ahead and use this Flexbox on our nav container. So I'm going back to this container here because I really want this to be the whole box. I don't want to just be dealing with my A tags anymore. I can make this flexible box by using the property display and setting it to flex. And you'll see my text moved when I did that. So that's my same point about different things are creating the styling. So even though we had set our text align to center earlier, Flexbox is going to throw things off. So how we can then change our content to be what we want, we'll use a property called justify our content, justify content. And justify content is basically saying, okay, everything within my flexible box, how do I want these things justified? So we have a couple different options. We can do, for example, space between, which will just basically put as much space between each of your elements. In this case, I'm just going to do space evenly. I want them to kind of just have an even amount of space between each of them. And that looks a lot better. I'm happy with that. Once again, I'm thinking that these are a little crowded, so I'm going to add some padding. Let's do maybe 10 pixels, and I'm okay with that happening around that entire box here. That's looking a lot better. Alrighty, so I want these links to be clickable, right? I'm expecting that the action that will happen here is people want to click on them. One thing that's really cool in CSS is we can use something called a pseudo class. So right now we've set some styling to our A tag. What I can do now using the pseudo class is I can say A, use a colon, and then I can say hover. And what you're saying here is, okay, I want this A tag, when it's hovered upon, I want something to happen. So let's say maybe when it's hovered upon, I want my color to change to blue. What that will look like now is this. That is a very small amount of code to add a really cool feature. It makes it easier for the user to figure out what the purpose of this is. And it also just helps the styling look a little bit more modern and responsive. And that is pretty much our portfolio. That's really all I have planned for today. I would like to share this code with you so that you have access to it. And then I'd like to just open it up for any questions that you might have. And I mean, feel free to ask truly anything that you want about HTML and CSS. I've shared the code in the chat for you. And yeah, any questions? Or I should say what questions? I'm sure there are questions. Feel free to type it in the chat if you don't want to shout it out.
Well, I have a question, but it's more like really general because I'm doing my well, I'm a Tatiana. Hello. I'm doing
Hi.
my I've been doing my portfolio for a while, but I'm
Mhm,
very like I like it. Well, it's very basic, but I've been struggling with responsivity or responsiveness. I don't know how to say.
mhm.
And yeah, a friend helped me, for example, with Flexbox. I'm doing the media tags, but it's like every time something is okay, then something else comes up. And
Yeah.
I'm testing responsivity simply using, the visualizing thing there in the web page when I go to like see my code.
Mhm.
And you can see it like and so I also close and open the window, and sometimes it's perfect, and then I don't know if well, I think my question is there a way to test how the code is responsive, but in a more exact way? Because I think this visual thing I can use in the see my code in the web page is like I don't understand if it really represents something real.
Sure.
Because sometimes they say, okay, you can see it how it would be in this phone, for example, in this
Mm.
iPhone, I don't know, 6, but it's I don't know how to explain. I would I would like to show you, but it's a bit difficult.
Do you
I don't
mean
know.
do you
Yeah.
mean this feature here?
Yes, this feature.
Yeah.
And then
Mhm.
when I manually open and close the window, like to say in the passages between, yes, this
Like
thing.
that. Mhm.
Yeah, there are things that are okay, and I was like, okay, this is done, and then something happens, and the things that were okay are not okay anymore, or new things comes out, and I'm
Mhm.
like the portfolio is done, but I can't use it because if someone look at it and try to
Yeah.
see if it's responsive or not.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the best answer because this really is from at least maybe Joy has a different answer. For me, this is the most reliable. I don't know if you know on this feature, you can actually select different devices that you would like to. Um, so you can see, but if you're saying that your issue is just as you fix one thing, then another thing looks bad, is that really your question?
Yes, because I have, for example, some icons that are okay in the wider page, it's in wider screens, and then they are okay in like smaller screens, but there is like a passage that they are not okay. Maybe it's simply I am the fact that I'm using the media text in some way that it's not working. Like it's working,
Yeah.
but partially.
Yeah. I- I'm
Yeah.
not I'm not sure, Joy. What do you think?
No, I think there could be a couple things. We would for sure have to see your code
Yeah.
because this could be an issue of what layout tool you used to build the site as well. Is it Flexbox? Is it grid? Do you have several margins in between things? Are they in these container boxes, or are the icons free floating, could also be, yeah, your breakpoints in your media queries are not where your layout breaks. So your layout is breaking a little bit before, so that's where the breakpoint should be, or it's too late, the breakpoint. With breakpoints, you kind of have to play around with the numbers. Is it 3 more pixels? Is it like 3 less pixels, So it's could be a lot of things.
Yeah. I think CSS is notoriously hard to debug because there are just so many different things interacting with each other. And it's funny because you think of programming languages as more difficult, but I really personally I find CSS incredibly challenging because You just have to, there's so much depth of knowledge in CSS, and
Mhm.
it's usually just not our priority. There's so much more to learn in JavaScript, so we don't necessarily spend that much time on CSS. But I do think that if you've worked on a project and you have a portfolio and you're having trouble, it's not a bad idea to take a break from it and go back to a foundational CSS course and go through it, and you'll be shocked how much you pick
Mhm.
up on that you didn't have knowledge of the first time and you didn't have something to associate it with.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm sorry, we don't have like a more specific answer. It's just, it
Yeah.
could be 1,000 different things, truly.
Yeah, I see that, and I was thinking about also maybe I have to go back because it's like that. The first time I was in a CSS course, it was okay. I'm understanding everything, but obviously I was not in my portfolio, so
Mhm.
or it can be that something got lost in my mind, and I have to go back. And I'm using Bootstrap, which is helping, but it's also complicating things.
Yep. Yeah, that's always how it goes. When you bring in new tools, it's helpful, but it also makes you realize what you don't know.
Yeah,
So yeah.
thank you.
I
Yeah,
wonder,
of course.
Sarah, if you could quickly maybe show everyone the dev tools where
Mhm.
CSS is concerned, so people can
Yeah,
start
definitely.
debugging there.
So this is, I just like to pull up my portfolio as an example because I know it. So I'll change it back to, have you encountered this, Tatiana? This happens to me every once in a while, and I don't know why it's happening, but usually if I refresh it, it fixes it. Okay, so in our dev tools, all right, I'm gonna get out of this. Okay,
Mhm.
in our dev tools here, we can right click and hit inspect. So the same way you would go to the console when you were working on your homework assignments. But if we click on elements here, we can see our HTML. And then what's really nice is we can then see down here all the CSS that's being applied to it. And there's a lot of stuff happening. This is also, I used a framework called Tailwind that helps with CSS. So some of this stuff may look a little overwhelming. I did not write all of this code. But what's really nice, what I really like, for example, is if I hover over this, it shows me my div container, which is that blue part. That green part is my padding. So I use this all the time to just check, okay, where's my padding? How is that showing up? I'm trying to think if I have margins anywhere. I don't think I do, but margins will show up, I believe, as orange. I think it might show it at the bottom here. Do you know, Joy, where that's at?
Yeah,
Normally?
it's mhm.
So we had, this is just the actual content. This is our padding. This would be the border if you had one, and this would be the margin if you had one. So that's really helpful as well. You can also interact with your CSS here. So for example, I could actually change this, and let's say I wanted to do space around or something. And then, okay, that wasn't a good example because it didn't actually change anything, but you could change things in your CSS dev tools here, and it will reflect it on the actual page. So you can mess around in these dev tools to figure out, okay, what's going to work, what's not going to work, and then go back to your actual code and make that final change. Another like just fun thing you can do is you can, on your dev tools on any website, you can basically like mess with the HTML. So like here I have this H2 heading that says, hi, I'm Sarah, but you could right click it and you could say edit as HTML. And here you could say like, hi, I'm Joy, and it'll change it on the page for you. So you could like go to NPR or CNN or whatever and change what you want on it. That's just like a fun little trick if you want to impress your friends, but that's not really helpful. I just wanted to share that.
One more thing before you move on, you see you've used Flexbox in a number of places, and the places where you use Flexbox, there's a little flex card or something. You can actually click that and it will show the flex elements that come up, like it's highlighted there.
You see that there?
Yeah, and if you have gaps, it will show. So it will help you to see how your layouting was done. So if you get confused or where is this breaking, what is in the flex box exactly, what is the child of this container, that helps. And I think if you go to the computed tab down or the layout tab down below, yeah, you can see you've got grid as well.
Whoa, I never even used this, Joy. See, Joy, you're always teaching me things.
No, it really helps, especially if you're using some
Yeah.
kind of grid or Flexbox to see where exactly is this happening. You can turn it on, you can turn it off. You can
Wow.
really get down deep in debugging your CSS. And if you do end up using a framework, which I recommend for styling, because it's hard managing a file with your styles and the actual, HTML document. You can also, as Sarah said, come to the browser. And Sarah, actually, if you double click on that section that's highlighted now, and then just delete
Ah,
Flex. Yeah, because you're using Tailwind and it's shipped to the browser. You can delete it and see that your styling breaks. Like,
very
so
cool.
all of this is completely editable. So you can try to track down your bugs this way.
Mm-hmm. And it
with
doesn't
the
affect your actual code. Like this is just, it's just living in your browser. So the moment you X out, like those changes are gone.
Exactly. So you could try things here. What if I change a margin? What if this is not a flex box? What if I change the media query? This is where you can really, really get down deep with debugging your CSS.
Thank you, Joy. That was so helpful.
Sure.
Any other questions?
I have two questions, I think. I mean, they're a bit related, but because you mentioned earlier that one of the tricky parts of CSS is kind of figuring out what styling applies to what elements and kind of like untangling that. I was wondering if you have any like good like tips or help to share in terms of like how to avoid that or how to go about that. And then separate from that, any other kind of, especially for people that are kind of quite new to it, any good practices, any tips, any things like, okay, when you start, these are some of the things you always want to keep in mind, like common mistakes or something to avoid.
Sure. So to answer your first question, I think that it is incredibly important to take the time to learn I'm not sure the right word that I'm looking for here, but basically the hierarchy of what styles get applied first. Do you know what, Joy, do you know what that's called in CSS? I just can't think of the word.
A cascade.
Yeah.
Essentially, yeah.
So there's plenty you can read out there, and we can find some resources for you. Joy may even have some prepared, but that's going to be the first place to start, because otherwise you're just going to go on a hunt for 10 years trying to figure out what's, it's really just tough with CSS, because if you're to the point where you're trying to debug something and you're not sure, you're probably already in a really bad spot. With CSS, I would say that you really want to put a lot of your effort into the preparation and understanding CSS and how it works, and then start diving into it. I feel like things, like with JavaScript or HTML, maybe it's more of just go do it, and then you can figure out where things are going wrong. For me personally, I would say with CSS, you really want to take the time to learn it and learn it well. I think that grid is an approachable way to lay out things. So if maybe Flexbox is overwhelming at first, grid is a good place to start. But Flexbox is very helpful once you know it well. So it's worth learning for sure. And then could you remind me what your second question was?
That was more just, general good practices, CSS, like something that you kind of, before, whenever I start, this is something how I go about things. And I always try to, these are some of in seeing like bad code or something like, oh, this is kind of what you want to avoid. This is a trap that I've seen people do, something. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that I learn really well by going to websites that are already out there and using those dev tools to see how they've used CSS styling. I think that's a good way to learn, because sometimes it just kind of feels like the wild, wild west with CSS, or I'm just going to throw stuff and hope it works. So I think it's helpful. And that's also true for, just searching repositories on GitHub and just finding good resources online, YouTube videos, etc. That's true for a lot of things. So that would be my advice. I don't know if Joy, maybe you had more to add.
I think, well, if you're working with a design, which you probably will be, some kind of a design, when you look at it, it helps me to kind of try to sort of draw out where the boxes are. So I know where my div containers need to be. What are the containers on this page? Like you might have text, like we saw in the example here, 2H, like two header elements together inside of a container. Maybe those two header elements need their own container as well. Maybe I need to style them and their container separately, So I guess that's something that I do, kind of try to break down the page mentally into containers, boxes, because that's all it is. And knowing which elements are like block level elements, which elements are inline, which elements are inline block, kind of stuff to be aware of before you start, so you know what applying a certain layouting tool like Flexbox or Grid will do to your elements. If it's a block element, if it's the inline element, which doesn't fall on another line, what will happen there? What happens if I have margin on a inline element? These kinds of things, yeah, you have to kind of read up first, or find the answer as you come up with the problem, Yeah, CSS it's tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah, it's so funny. My partner, he's a data engineer now, but he started as a web developer. So he's been coding for 5 years now, and he's coded in many languages, and he hates CSS. Like that's his least favorite. So just know that it's everyone finds CSS a little bit wonky. It's just kind of tricky, but the nice thing is there is a solution, and it feels really good when you get it. And there's a lot of resources online to help yourself. But I like Joy's idea about drawing it out and really having that picture in your head ahead of time. Because it's smart to just think of it like it's boxes. That's all it is. It's more than that, but it really is just boxes. And so having that outline can kind of help you organize what really needs to be happening.
I'm actually oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No.
No, I'm actually trying to find an extension that I had way back when I was learning. You click on it and it shows any website the boxes that are on the page, like so it draws borders around all block level elements.
Cool.
Yeah, so that can help you start having a mental diagram of a site. So I'm gonna try to find that for you guys, so you can use it. It was a Chrome extension, if I recall, cool. But it's nice little visual. Ooh,
and then you'll also find with CSS that, like Joy mentioned, using a framework. I really like Tailwind, but it's occurred to me, well, if I use Tailwind for everything, once I get into this new developer role, if they're not using Tailwind, well, shoot, I gotta really go back and learn CSS. So we kind of had talked about that earlier, but frameworks are so helpful, but if you don't know the foundations well, you can get yourself into a tricky spot. So it's kind of a balance. I mean, frameworks do help us.
Stupid question. What is Tailwind?
Oh, so Tailwind is a framework. So when we say that, it's basically a simplified way of thinking of it is it's like a set of tools that is going to do a lot of the work for you. So now for me, when I'm writing code, instead of having to have a CSS file with all these different selectors, what I can do is basically just add an attribute to my HTML that is specific words, and it basically will have Tailwind do the work of creating the CSS that will match the words that I've told them. So instead of having to say like color colon, and then a hex code, I can just say like background or BG dash indigo 500 or something like that, and it will just make that happen, which is really nice. So it takes a lot of the work away. But like I said, that can also be dangerous.
So Sarah, can you tell us a bit about your upcoming role and the tech stack and the interview process and how it went?
Definitely. So I'll just talk about my journey job searching. I think like the day after I graduated, I had an interview. My partner's company is a consulting firm. And so they reached out to me. And so I did an interview with them. And I think I had to do FizzBuzz, if you remember, that's on your homework. And then I had to do a function that was something to do with prime numbers. I think it was like determine if a number is prime. And I was terrified. I was so nervous. I was just like, I don't know how to do this. And CodeOps like such a safe environment. And then it's like, wait, this is the real world now. But it was totally fine. It was like, every interview, they're not looking for it to be perfect. They want to see your thought process. So really the most important thing is talk about what you're doing. Even if you're stuck, just start talking about, well, what are possible solutions? What are you thinking? How is your thinking influenced? And so with that interview, I had really positive feedback. They wanted to hire me, but they didn't have a role because it was a consulting firm and they don't have junior positions. So they were talking to clients, trying to find it, but it just didn't work out. So unfortunately, I had to just keep job searching. I had one interview with a company that was, I think the coding challenges were PHP, which I didn't know. There was then JavaScript, and then there was a Bootstrap section, which Bootstrap is a CSS framework, I think, library, I'm not sure. But anyways, bombed that. I knew the JavaScript. I didn't know PHP or Bootstrap, so that didn't go well, but it's okay. And then I just kind of I had this like stroke of luck. A couple weeks ago, I just had 3 interviews lined up all of a sudden. And the company that I ended up accepting an offer from is a large corporation in America that's called H&R Block. I doubt anyone's familiar. It's international, but I don't think it's in Europe. But anyways, really cool situation. They have this program called Accelerate that they want to bring in tech talent that is underrepresented. So they were looking for women, non-binary, people of color, people that just aren't white men, basically. And it was a really cool interview process because they were much more interested in your soft skills. Can you communicate? Can you teach? Because that's an important skill in coding. And can you learn? Are you open? So I had 3 rounds. I had a phone interview with a recruiter. I had then a panel with 2 IT managers at the company, and then a final round interview with the program manager. And none of it was really technical. I mean, my panel interview they asked me to talk about a project. So I used my capstone project from CodeOp. And I just talked through what I did on the project, what were the challenges I found, what did I enjoy working on. And that was about it as far as technical, which was really nice. And then, yeah, so I'll start in January. It's a completely different tech stack. And I think this is partly why they weren't so concerned with skills do you have now, because they want to bring in people who are moldable and they're going to teach us the tech stack. So it will be C# backend and then Angular front end. And Angular is a framework library. I really need to figure these things out. But basically that's what I'll be working with. And then the cloud stuff is Azure. So that's starting in January. Wow. No idea what team I'll be on. I really don't know that much information, but I'm really happy because everyone I interacted with was like very kind and positive. And I think that's the most important thing. So
amazing, yeah. Amazing. Well done.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah.
Yeah, of course, of course. Thank you so much. Thank you. Any other questions? It can be about anything. It doesn't have to be HTML and CSS. No, nothing. All right. Well, I will, I'm going to share my email and my LinkedIn in the chat, just in case you did want to get in contact. Let me get it pulled up here though. But feel free to add me on LinkedIn if you want to talk about my journey, or you just have questions, or you just want to make new connections in the tech world. I am located in America, so it's a maybe slightly different industry here. And that's my email, but feel free to reach out. I love making new connections, and I love Code Up because I think it's just like the best environment I've ever been a part of. So I really enjoyed working with you today, and I'd love to hear from you if you do want to reach out. But you guys are so lucky to have Joy. I'm kind of jealous. I want Joy back.
Thanks, Sarah.
You're
Thank
so
you for
welcome.
coming in and talking with us and sharing a bit about
course.
your journey and HTML and CSS. It was really, really great to have you today.
Yay, I'm so glad. Thank you, everyone. And I hope to hear from you guys later. See you later.
All right. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so a bit of a change of pace today. It was nice. Like, oh, let me stop recording so that